For Eleanor Vance, the morning always began long before the first ray of sun could touch the tops of the old pines that grew right up to her fence. It began with silence, not the empty urban silence that rings in the ears, but another kind, a living one, filled with millions of barely perceptible sounds: the sleepy rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl finishing its nightly hunt, the creak of old floorboards beneath her feet. This silence was her companion, her solace, her world. She would rise with the first still gray hints of dawn, drape an old faded shawl over her shoulders, and go to stoke the wood stove. Her movements were slow, unhurried, refined by decades of repetition. She'd open the cast-iron door, place dry birch bark inside, then stack the pine logs she had chopped the evening before. A single match, and a cheerful living fire would rush up the chimney with a grateful roar. Soon a thick, resinous aroma began to drift through the cabin, mingling with the scent of dried herbs hanging in bunches from the ceiling: St. John's wort, thyme, and fireweed. This was the scent of her home, the scent of her life. While the kettle on the stove came to a boil, Eleanor would step out onto the porch. High up on several steps, it was her captain's bridge, from which she surveyed her domain each morning. And her domain wasn't vast: a small but well-kept yard, an old well with a wooden sweep, a leaning but sturdy shed, and a front garden where the last of the autumn asters were still in bloom. And just beyond the low picket fence, it began, the gloomwood. Immense, boundless, it stood as a silent, dark wall, making it seem as if her house were the last outpost of the human world, on the border of something ancient, mighty, and incomprehensible. The people in the nearby town were wary of her, an old woman living alone on the outskirts, consorting with the forest. A witch, they whispered, nothing less. But Eleanor wasn't a witch. She was simply part of this forest, just like the old gnarled oak that grew by her gate. Her husband, Ethan, had been a park ranger. He had taught her to understand this world, to read its signs, to respect its laws. After his death 10 years ago, the forest became her only family. God had not blessed them with children, and now the trees were her children and the forest animals her grandchildren. She stood on the porch, breathing in the cool, damp air, and she waited. He appeared, as always, without a sound. He emerged from the morning mist that still swirled at the edge of the woods, huge, gray, with a powerful broad chest and intelligent amber eyes. He moved with the lazy, confident grace of a master, and only a slight, almost imperceptible asymmetry in his gait betrayed an old injury. This was Gray. He didn't approach the gate, but rather a spot in the fence where one of the boards had been intentionally left loose. He easily pushed it aside with his shoulder, slipped into the yard, and just as easily set it back in place. He walked to the porch, sat at its base, and tilting his head up, looked at Eleanor. This was not the devotion of a dog. There was no fawning in his gaze. He didn't wag his tail or try to leap upon her chest. His look held a calm, steady dignity, acknowledgement. He was a wild creature, a free son of the forest, but he acknowledged this old woman as his pack, the only member of his pack. "Hello, Gray," Eleanor said just as quietly. "You're back, you wanderer? Was the hunt successful?" In response, the wolf only opened its mouth slightly, letting its long pink tongue hang out, which was his highest expression of friendliness. She went inside and brought him what she always prepared the evening before, a large piece of cooked meat. She never gave him raw meat so as not to awaken any unnecessary aggression in him. Gray carefully took the meat from her hands with just his canines, walked to the side, placed it on the ground, and began his meal. He ate unhurriedly, with a sense of dignity, occasionally lifting his head to glance at Eleanor. Their relationship was an unspoken agreement forged several years ago, an agreement sealed not with words, but with compassion and gratitude. He was her protector, her silent guardian, and she was his home, his quiet harbor in a cruel world that had once already passed a death sentence upon him. Having finished his breakfast, Gray went to the rain barrel, drank long and noisily, and then looked at Eleanor again. A farewell. His duty to her for the morning was done. Now the forest, his true domain, was calling him. Just as silently, he slipped toward the secret passage in the fence and, a moment later, vanished into the gray haze of the mist. Eleanor watched him go for a long time. Each of his returns was a small miracle to her. Every morning she feared he wouldn't come, that his instincts would take over and he would leave forever to form his own real pack, or that a hunter's or poacher's bullet would find him. But he returned, again and again, as if an invisible thread stretched between her heart and his was stronger than the call of the wild and the laws of nature. She sighed and went back inside. The day promised to be long. She needed to check the snares for rabbits which she set not for herself, but for him in case of an unsuccessful hunt. She had to gather the last of the St. John's wort before the first frost hit, and patch the roof of the shed. The life of a solitary woman in the woods was full of simple but urgent tasks, and this routine, this daily labor, saved her from the heavy thoughts and memories that washed over her with particular sharpness in the autumn. She worked until noon, and then, tired, sat on her porch with a mug of her herbal tea. The sun had risen high, dispersed the fog, and warmed the earth, and in this peaceful midday silence she heard a sound that put her on alert. The roar of an engine. An unfamiliar, arrogant sound, unlike the chugging of the old tractors or motorcycles that occasionally passed on the distant road. A brand new gleaming Jeep appeared on the dirt track that led to a dead end at her house. It pulled up to her gate and, with a snort, stalled. Frank Keller heaved himself out. Her neighbor. Well, he was a neighbor in a loose sense. His sturdy brick house, enclosed by a high fence, stood at the other end of the town. But Frank considered himself the master of the whole area. Wealthy, having made his fortune in the murky 90s through some shady dealings, he bought up land, built and resold. He was a man of the new era, unscrupulous, greedy, recognizing nothing but power and money. He sauntered to the gate. "Hey there, Eleanor," he shouted with the kind of over-familiarity she detested. "And a good day to you, Frank," Eleanor replied calmly, not getting up. "What brings you here?" "Oh, just passing by. Thought I'd check in." He leaned on the fence, surveying her house and yard with a proprietary gaze. "Still all alone out here? Aren't you scared, right next to the woods? Must be full of all sorts of critters." "The forest is my friend, Frank, and the animals don't bother me. I don't bother them either." A metallic edge entered her voice. Right, Keller sneered. "A friend. Listen, I'm here on business. For the 100th time, probably, but use your head, old woman. What do you need this wreck for? And this plot of land? The location is gold. I could build a fantastic tourist complex here, with a sauna, cabins for hunters. I'd be raking in cash, and I'd pay you well. You could buy yourself a nice condo in the city, live like a person, in the warmth, with hot water, closer to people." His voice became smooth, honeyed, but its sweetness only made Eleanor feel more disgusted. She rose slowly, her small, wiry frame suddenly filled with an unbending dignity. "I've told you 100 times, Frank, and I'll tell you for the 101st. This is my home and my husband Ethan's. We built it with our own hands. Our whole life was spent here, and this land is a memory. And memories, Frank, are not for sale, not for any amount of money." Keller's face darkened. The mask of good nature fell away. "You're a fool, Eleanor, stubborn as a mule. You don't see what's good for you. Well, you watch. If you won't do it the easy way, we'll do it the hard way. You'll come running to me yourself, but it'll be too late." He spat angrily on the ground, turned, and without another word, climbed into his vehicle. The engine roared, and the jeep sped away, kicking up clouds of dust. Eleanor watched him go for a long time. She knew his threats were not empty words. This man would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. She felt a cold, unpleasant knot of anxiety tighten in her chest. But then she looked at the forest, at her old but sturdy house, and the anxiety subsided. This was her land, and she would stand for it, to the end. She didn't yet know that her greatest protector was, at that very moment, lying somewhere in a forest thicket, but was already sensing his mistress's unease and turning his head toward the house. His house, which he too would defend, to his last breath. Before going to sleep that evening, Eleanor sat for a long time by the window, gazing at the dark, impenetrable wall of the gloomwood. Frank's threats kept replaying in her mind. She knew the man too well to dismiss his words as drunken bluster. In his small, deep-set eyes she had seen a cold, calculating malice that doesn't forgive rejection, and she felt that this malice was directed not only at her, but at her entire world, of which Gray was a part. Her memory helpfully supplied a scene from 4 years ago. The weather had been just as quiet, as transparently autumnal. She had gone into the woods for honey mushrooms, which she knew would sprout on old stumps after the rains. She had wandered far, deep into the wilderness to places where human feet rarely tread. Her basket was almost full, and she was about to turn back when she caught a faint, pitiful whine. At first she thought it was a fledgling that had fallen from its nest, but the sound was too persistent, too desperate. She followed it, and at the base of an old, sprawling fir tree, she saw a terrible sight. A dead she-wolf lay on the ground in a pool of dried blood. Huge and strong, she had apparently been caught in a poacher's trap, which had been crudely removed, but the wound was fatal. She had dragged herself towards her den to the very last, but her strength had failed her just a few yards away, and next to her, already cooling body, nudging its blind muzzle into the cold fur, a tiny newborn pup crawled and whimpered, a single one. The poachers had likely taken the others and simply left this one, the weakest, to die. Eleanor's first impulse as a long-time resident of the forest was to walk away, not to interfere. Such is the law of the wild, cruel but fair. The weak perish, the strongest survive. She, like her late husband Ethan, had always honored this law, but she couldn't. She looked at this tiny, trembling bundle of life, desperately clinging to a world that had already betrayed it, and her heart faltered. She saw in it not a predator, not a future enemy of the local farms, but simply a child that had lost its mother. She cursed herself for an old fool, knowing she was making a mistake, going against nature, but her feet carried her forward on their own. She gently moved the dead she-wolf's body, picked up the whimpering pup, wrapped it in her warm sweater, and carried it home. Nursing him back to health was a miracle. He was too weak. She fed him goat's milk from a bottle which she bought in town, telling everyone she had found a sick puppy. She spent sleepless nights warming him with her own body. She treated his wounds with herbal decoctions, as she would have treated her own child. And he survived. Against all odds, he survived. She named him Gray. He grew up in her shed, and from the very beginning, she treated him not like a domestic pet. She didn't scratch him behind the ears or try to teach him commands. She respected his wild nature. She understood that she was keeping a wolf, not a dog. When he grew strong and mature, she made a secret opening for him in the fence, giving him a choice. And he left. He went into the forest. She thought she would never see him again, that the call of the wild would prove stronger. For the first few days she was beside herself with worry, but one morning she stepped out onto the porch as usual and saw him. He was sitting by the gate, waiting. He hadn't left for good. He was simply returning to his true home, but now he had another one, a home where he was loved and awaited. and so it had been ever since. He lived his own wolf life, hunting, roaming the woods, but almost every morning he would come to her, to check in, to give thanks, to remind her that he remembered. He was her secret, her joy, and her constant worry. And now this secret was in danger. Frank, with his greed and malice, could destroy this fragile world she had so carefully and lovingly built. Her memories were interrupted by a soft rustle outside the window. Eleanor flinched, but it wasn't Frank. It was Gray returned. He didn't enter the yard, but lay down right by the fence in the shadow of an old rowan tree and fixed his gaze on the road leading from the town. He sensed it too. He had taken up his post. Eleanor slept poorly that night, and in the morning, when she went to the spring for water, she discovered the first act of spite. The path she had walked for decades was blocked by freshly felled aspen trunks. Someone had worked through the night to bar her way. It was childishly petty, but very much in Frank's style, to show who was boss. Eleanor just shook her head, sighed, and took the long way around. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her annoyance. A few days later, another nasty trick. A handful of broken bottle glass was scattered right by her gate. Bright green, sharp shards glinted dangerously in the grass. The calculation was simple. Either she would step on it herself, or her little animal would get hurt. Cursing under her breath, Eleanor took a broom and dustpan and spent over an hour on her knees, meticulously collecting every single shard. Gray, watching her from behind the fence, growled softly, looking towards the town. He understood everything, but Frank didn't let up. Seeing no resistance, he grew bolder. He began to spread rumors through the town that Eleanor was a witch, that she consorted with dark forces, with wolves, that her animal was no animal at all but a shapeshifter. The townspeople, already wary of her, began to openly shun her. The clerk at the general store served her in silence, avoiding her eyes. The men would spit and cross themselves when they saw her. Eleanor was heartbroken, but she held her head high. She knew she had a reputation for being odd, but she wasn't evil, and this injustice wounded her. Gray sensed the change in her mood. He began to spend almost all his time near the house. He would only go into the forest for short periods to hunt, and then immediately return. He often lay in the raspberry bushes by the fence, his body tense as a coiled spring. He was waiting, and his wait was not in vain. Frank Keller's patience snapped on Saturday. Some important people from the city had come to visit him during the day, potential investors to whom he was painting a glorious picture of the future tourist complex on the site of the old woman's hovel. He showed them around his property, pointing to the picturesque forest, the hills, promising elite hunting and fishing. The guests were pleased, but one of them, the most important one, pointed to Eleanor's house and said, "The spot is good, Frank, but this plot here ruins the whole thing. It's an enclave. Solve that problem and we'll talk serious money." Those words were the trigger for Frank. After his guests left, he drank. He drank heavily, angrily, and alone. Greed, mixed with alcohol and rage at the stubborn old woman, turned into a poisonous cocktail. He felt humiliated. He, Frank Keller, a master of his domain, couldn't handle some godforsaken widow. The petty tricks hadn't worked. She ignored them as if he were a pesky fly. It was time, then, to move on to more persuasive arguments. As evening approached, when the sun had almost disappeared behind the pine tops, he staggered out of his house and headed straight for Eleanor's homestead. He wasn't just drunk. He was in that stage of intoxication where all fears and conscience are completely atrophied. Eleanor was in the yard at the time, hanging laundry on the line. She heard his loud, drunken voice from a distance. "Eleanor! Hey, you old witch, come on out. We need to talk." Her heart gave an anxious leap. She straightened up, looking towards his shouts. Frank was already at her gate, gripping it with both hands and shaking it back and forth. His face was crimson, his eyes cloudy and vicious. "I'm giving you one last offer, you old hag," he yelled, his voice carrying across the quiet landscape. "Sell the house, tomorrow, for the pennies I'm offering. If you don't, I swear I'll smoke you out of here. You'll burn with your shack, and no one will even remember you were here. You understand me?" Eleanor stared at him in silence. She wasn't afraid. She felt disgust and a deep, cold fury. How could anyone be such a person? How could someone sink so low? "Go away, Frank," she said quietly but firmly. "Sleep it off." "You're going to tell me what to do?" he roared, trying to climb over the low fence, but his drunken legs wouldn't obey. I'll show you who's boss here." He fumbled on the ground, found a heavy rock, and, with a great swing, hurled it towards the house. The rock hit the wall next to a window and fell to the ground with a dull thud. And at that very moment something happened that Frank, in his drunken stupor, could never have expected. From behind the house, out of the deep shadow of an old apple tree, a gray shadow emerged without a sound. It moved smoothly, almost surreally, like a phantom. A huge wolf. It didn't run, didn't snarl, didn't bark. It simply walked, slowly, with the inevitability of fate itself. It passed by Eleanor, lightly brushing her leg with its side as if to say, "Step aside, mistress. This is my job now." It stopped a few yards from the fence, directly opposite the stunned Frank. Frank froze, his hand raised for another throw. The alcoholic fog in his head instantly evaporated, replaced by an icy terror that chilled him to the bone. He stared at the beast, his mind refusing to believe what it saw. This was no animal from around here. No creature in the world moved like that, looked like that. A powerful body, a broad chest, the predatory, slightly slanted set of its amber eyes. It was a wolf, a real, wild, enormous wolf. Gray stood and watched, simply watched. His gaze was devoid of emotion. It was the cold, calm, assessing gaze of a predator looking at its prey. A gaze that said one thing, one wrong move, and you are dead. In that look was the promise of a swift and certain end. Frank slowly, very slowly, lowered his hand with the rock. His face turned from crimson to a deathly pale. He backed away, his back hitting his jeep. A wolf," he rasped, his voice like the rustling of dry leaves. Gray tilted his head slightly, never taking his eyes off him. And then a sound came from his throat. It wasn't a snarl. It was a low, guttural, vibrating rumble that seemed to make the ground tremble. The sound of absolute, indisputable authority. Frank couldn't take it. Animal terror broke his will. He spun around, clumsily yanked open the car door, fell inside, and fumbling for the ignition key, started the engine. The Jeep roared and, spinning on the spot, shot off towards the town, leaving a cloud of dust behind. Gray watched it go. When the vehicle was out of sight, he turned his head to Eleanor. The rumbling stopped. He walked over to her, nudged her hand with his cold, wet nose, and circling the house, vanished as silently as he had appeared into the woods. His watch for the day was over. Eleanor was left standing alone in the middle of her yard. Her legs were trembling, but not from fear, from the realization of what had just happened. For the first time in all these years, Gray had revealed himself. He had stepped out of the shadows to protect her. He, a wild beast, had stood in her way, a faithful guardian blocking the path of human malice and depravity. She looked towards the forest where her wolf had gone, and tears welled up in her eyes, tears of gratitude and pride. She knew that Frank wouldn't back down so easily now. He understood that she had a defender, and he would most likely try to remove that defender. But she also knew that she was no longer alone, and whatever happened next, they would face it together. Two solitary beings on the edge of the forest, bound by ties stronger than kinship. the bonds of a saved life, and boundless, silent loyalty. After that night, everything changed. Frank's drunken visit and Gray's appearance became the line that divided their quiet war into before and after. Frank's terror, animalistic and humiliating, quickly gave way to a cold, calculated fury. He had been publicly shamed, made to look like a coward in front of some old woman and her creature. His wounded pride could not forgive this, but he also understood that he could no longer act rashly. Eleanor had a protector, a terrifying, unpredictable, silent one. To get to the old woman, he had to eliminate her guardian first. Frank laid low. He no longer appeared at Eleanor's fence, no longer shouted threats. He became quiet and inconspicuous, and this silence was far more frightening than his drunken rampages. He began to act cunningly like a fox. He started to study his new enemy. He would sit for hours at his window with a powerful pair of binoculars watching the edge of the forest near Eleanor's house. He saw her come out into the yard, go about her chores, but he no longer saw the wolf. Gray, as if sensing the new threat, had become even more cautious. He stopped coming into the yard during the day. Eleanor saw him only in the early morning, when he would silently emerge from the mist, and late in the evening, when he would see her safely into the house. But Frank was an experienced hunter, not like Eleanor's late husband, Ethan, who respected the laws of the forest. Frank was a poacher at heart, for whom a beast was not to be respected, but to be outsmarted, tricked, and caught. He began to track Gray in the woods. He found his tracks, studied his hunting routes. He quickly realized that although the wolf lived near the old woman's house, he spent most of his time in the forest, on his own territory, and that was where he had to be taken down. One day, Eleanor, on her usual trip to the distant spring, stumbled upon a strange find. On a wolf trail that Gray often used lay a large piece of meat, fresh, bloody. Any predator would not have passed up such a treat, but Eleanor immediately sensed something was wrong. She went closer. The meat was generously sprinkled with some white powder, like salt. Poison. Her heart sank. She realized Frank had begun his campaign. He was trying to poison Gray. Without a second thought, she found a long stick carefully so as not to touch it with her hands, picked up the poisoned bait, and carried it far from the path, burying it deep in a hole under the upturned roots of an old fir tree. All day she was on edge. She waited for Gray with a sinking heart, fearing he might have found another piece of bait. But that evening he came, alive and unharmed. With his wild senses, he had likely smelled the foreign, dangerous human scent on the bait and left it untouched. Or perhaps he was protected by that invisible bond between him and Eleanor. The next day she found another piece of poisoned meat, and another the day after that. Frank was persistent. Each time Eleanor, at her own risk, destroyed the bait, it turned into a dangerous game. She followed her wolf's tracks to protect him from the tracks of his enemy. Seeing that the poison wasn't working, Frank changed his tactics. He decided to trap him. In the places where Gray's roots most often passed, steel traps began to appear. Powerful and deadly, they were skillfully camouflaged under a layer of leaves and moss. Eleanor, knowing every path in her forest, found them. With great difficulty, risking injury to her hands, she disarmed them and then carried them away to drown in the deepest part of the forest stream. She understood that this couldn't go on for long. Sooner or later she would miss one, or Gray would turn onto an unfamiliar trail. She lived in constant fear. At night, she had nightmares in which she heard the mournful howl of her wolf, caught in the steel teeth of a trap. She needed to talk to Frank, to try to appeal to his conscience if he had one. Gathering her courage, she went to his house herself. He was in the yard, fixing his tractor. Seeing her, he straightened up and smirked. "What is it, Eleanor? Come to surrender. decided to sell. That's not why I'm here, Frank, she said firmly, looking him straight in the eye. Stop it. Leave the animal alone. He's done nothing to you. The animal? Frank laughed. You mean your little pet? That's a wolf, Eleanor, a predator. It has no place near people. I'm doing a public service, you could say, clearing the forest of vermin. Today he looks at me. Tomorrow he'll be killing your chickens, or, God forbid, go after a person. He won't, she answered quietly. He's smarter than a lot of people. What do you see in him, old woman? Frank asked with genuine bewilderment. You've warmed a viper in your bosom, or rather, a wolf. He'll show you his gratitude one day. He'll bite the hand that feeds him. Mark my words. You wish, Eleanor retorted. I'm asking you, Frank, as one person to another, remove your traps. Don't sin your soul. Or what? His face turned nasty again. You'll go complain. To who? The sheriff? He's a friend of mine. We'll just say you've gone crazy from loneliness, raising wolves. They'll lock you up in a mental hospital, and I, as a good neighbor, will look after your little house. He laughed again, that ugly, cackling laugh of his. Eleanor realized it was useless to talk to him. He was deaf to any argument but the language of money and force. She turned silently and walked home. Now she knew there would be no compromise. This was a war of annihilation. It was either him or her wolf, and she would protect her gray to the very end. The point of no return had been crossed. After Eleanor's visit, Frank knew the old woman would not back down. Her quiet stubbornness enraged him more than open hostility, and the existence of the wolf, that silent gray guardian, had become a personal insult. He, Frank Keller, feared by everyone in the county, had backed down from some animal. The thought burned inside him, keeping him awake at night. The idea came to him suddenly, simple and terrible in its logic. If he couldn't get rid of the wolf, he had to get rid of the reason it stayed. The house, the old woman herself. No house, no problem, and on the ashes, he could build whatever he wanted. No one would say a word. It could always be blamed on an accident, an old woman, a faulty stove, old wiring. No one would ever find out. The plan formed quickly. He needed to choose the right night. A night when the wind blew from the town towards the forest, so the smoke and flames wouldn't be noticed immediately. A night when the wolf would likely be out hunting, far from the house, so it couldn't interfere. He watched for several days, waiting for the perfect moment. And that moment came. Towards the end of the week, the weather turned foul. A strong, gusty wind blew from the north. Heavy clouds covered the sky, promising rain but not yet shedding a drop. The night promised to be dark and windy. Perfect conditions. That day, a distant relative of Eleanor's, her husband's nephew, had visited from the city. He brought her groceries and helped her with some paperwork for the house and land. She had decided to write a will just in case, so her property wouldn't fall into the hands of that scoundrel Keller after her death. Frank saw the nephew's car from his window and realized the old woman was up to something. That was the last straw. He decided to act that very night. When deep twilight turned into impenetrable darkness, Frank set his plan in motion. He put on old, dark clothes, pulled a cap down over his face. He took a can of gasoline he always kept in the shed for his chainsaw and a stack of old newspapers. He didn't take the road. He went the long way around, through the forest, to approach Eleanor's house from the back, the darkest and most concealed side. He moved quietly, like a predator. Adrenaline surged through his veins, silencing the last remnants of his conscience. He circled the house and approached the old woodshed, which stood right next to the cabin. Its walls were made of dry, time-resined planks, perfect kindling. He listened. The house was dark and silent. The old woman was asleep. The yard was quiet too. The animal, or whatever it was, couldn't be heard. It had likely gone on its nightly hunt. The plan was working perfectly. With hands trembling from excitement, Frank unscrewed the cap of the canister. The sharp, acrid smell of gasoline hit his nose. He generously, without sparing a drop, doused the wall of the shed, the dry woodpile next to it, the grass at the foundation. Then he crumpled the newspapers, tucked them under the wall, and struck a match. The dry paper ignited instantly. The fire greedily licked the gasoline-soaked boards, and a second later, the shed wall was ablaze with a bright, furious flame. The wind immediately caught the fire, fanning it, throwing sparks onto the roof, onto the dry branches of the old apple tree. Frank jumped back into the shadows, staring with predatory delight at his handiwork. A few more minutes and the fire would spread to the house. It would all be over. He had almost turned to leave as quietly as he had come when he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It wasn't a howl. It was a low, guttural, rage-filled growl. And it wasn't coming from the forest. It was coming from behind him. Frank spun around. A few steps away, in the uneven, dancing light of the flames, stood him. Gray, huge, tense like a coiled spring. The fur on his hackles stood on end, making him look even larger. Puffs of steam escaped from his bared teeth. And his eyes. His amber eyes burned in the darkness with a hellish, inhuman fire. The wolf hadn't gone hunting, or he had already returned. He had been here all along, in the shadows, waiting. Frank froze, paralyzed with terror. He looked at the enraged beast and knew that he was about to die. He wanted to scream, but only a pathetic, hoarse croak escaped his throat. But Gray didn't lunge at him. He did something far more terrifying. He began to advance, slowly, inexorably, cutting off Frank's path of retreat, pinning him against the wall of fire. At that moment, Eleanor, awakened by the crackling of burning wood and the acrid smell of smoke, rushed out onto the porch. She saw the blazing shed. She saw the figure of Frank scrambling near the fire, and her wolf, who, like a fearsome judge, was delivering his verdict. "Fire!" she screamed at the top of her lungs, grabbing buckets. "We're on fire!" Her cry, carried by the wind, reached the nearest houses. Lights flickered in windows, and answering shouts were heard. Frank, seeing he had been spotted, fell into despair. He darted to the side, trying to break past the wolf. But Gray was faster. He didn't bite him. He simply knocked him off his feet with a powerful shoulder slam, and pinning him to the ground, sank his teeth into his thick jacket. He wasn't tearing, he was just holding, firmly with a death grip. People were already running towards the house with buckets and shovels. The first to arrive was a neighbor, old Mr. Miller. He froze in his tracks, seeing the incredible scene. The burning shed, Eleanor trying to beat back the flames, Frank lying on the ground, and a huge wolf holding him down. "Don't be afraid, Michael, he won't hurt you," Eleanor shouted. "Help me put it out." The people, overcoming their initial fear, rushed to help. Some doused the fire with water, others threw dirt on it. Under the combined effort, the flames began to recede. Soon the local sheriff arrived, woken by the commotion. He too was stunned by the scene. "Eleanor, what's going on here?" he asked, approaching cautiously. "Get that animal off him." "That's not just an animal," Eleanor replied calmly, catching her breath. "That's justice. As for him," she nodded at Frank, "let him tell you everything himself, about how my stove just caught fire on its own." Frank, broken, humiliated, caught red-handed in front of the whole town, knew it was useless to deny it. When Gray, at a command from Eleanor, released his grip, he, sobbing and smearing dirt across his face, confessed to everything. The threats, the arson. The sheriff just shook his head, taking down his statement. The other people were silent. They looked from the pathetic, crying Frank to the proud, unbent old woman, to the huge gray wolf who sat calmly at his mistress's feet, resting his head on her lap. That night they saw it all with their own eyes. They saw human depravity and animal nobility. and none of them ever dared to call Eleanor Vance a witch again. In their eyes, she had become someone else, a guardian, a keeper of an ancient forest law that proved to be more honest and just than man's. And her gray wolf, its faithful and silent sentinel. A year passed. Autumn once again took hold, painting the gloomwood in the same piercingly bright colors as the year before. But this was a different autumn, calm, peaceful, without the aftertaste of anxiety and fear. The night of the fire became a local legend. It was retold in whispers at the well, discussed by men in the general store, recalled by women on their porches. In these stories, Frank Keller became a pathetic, cartoonish villain, and Eleanor Vance the unofficial matriarch of the area, a woman you didn't cross. They no longer considered her a witch. They respected her, with that special, silent form of respect reserved for people who live by their own unwritten but understandable code of honor. Frank was convicted. Not for long, but the criminal record and the shame did their work. He sold his brick mansion and left town. Rumor had it he had drunk himself into oblivion somewhere in the city. His land was sold to new owners, a quiet couple seeking solitude who barely interacted with Eleanor but always greeted her politely. Life at the homestead returned to its familiar rhythm, but it too had changed. Eleanor was no longer alone. Her secret was no longer a secret. The whole town knew about Gray, and although people still gave her house a wide berth, there was no longer fear or condemnation in their eyes. There was curiosity and a touch of superstitious reverence. They saw the huge wolf lying on her porch, saw him accompany her to the edge of the woods when she went mushroom picking. They saw this incredible, unbelievable friendship and couldn't understand it, so they simply accepted it as a fact of life. Gray had changed too. He became calmer, more confident. He no longer hid. He became the rightful master of this yard, this forest edge. He still went on his wolf hunts, but he always came back. Sometimes he wouldn't appear in the morning, and Eleanor's heart would clench with anxiety. But by evening she would invariably see the familiar gray silhouette emerging from the woods. He always returned. This was his home. Their morning meeting on the porch remained their most important ritual. She would bring him meat. He would accept it gratefully, and then they would just sit side by side, each lost in their own thoughts, but feeling the calm, peaceful presence of the other. One late autumn, after the first snow had fallen, disaster struck. Eleanor, returning from the forest with a basket of cranberries, slipped on an icy root and fell awkwardly, badly twisting her ankle. The pain was so sharp that her vision went dark. She tried to stand, but couldn't. Her ankle was swelling and burning like fire. She was trapped. The house was about 1 kilometer away. The town was even farther. It was useless to shout. No one would hear. There had never been cell service out here in the woods. The sun was already setting, and it was getting cold fast. She realized she might simply freeze to death here in her beloved forest. She sat on the cold, frozen ground, leaning against the trunk of a pine tree as despair began to creep in. And at that moment she heard a soft rustle. From behind the trees, Gray emerged. He must have sensed that she was taking too long to return and had come looking for her. He approached her, nudged her face with his nose, and whined with concern. "Well, Gray, I've gotten myself into a bit of trouble," Eleanor said with a bitter smile, stroking his neck. "My leg. I don't think I can make it home." The wolf, as if understanding everything, carefully sniffed her injured leg. Then he raised his head and let out a long, loud howl. It wasn't a mournful call, not a threatening growl. It was a summons, a signal for help. He howled for a long time, several times, his muzzle pointed towards the darkening sky. Then he lay down next to Eleanor, pressing his warm, strong body against hers, keeping her warm. His howl was heard in the town. At first, no one paid it much mind. A wolf is a wolf. But Mr. Miller, the same neighbor who had been the first to arrive at the fire, grew worried. He knew Eleanor's wolf didn't howl like that for no reason. He gathered a couple of other men, they grabbed flashlights, and headed towards the forest. They found her in complete darkness. She was sitting under the pine tree, almost unconscious from pain and cold, and next to her, like a faithful hound, lay the enormous wolf. Seeing the men, Gray stood up and let out a low growl, blocking their path. "It's all right, Gray. It's us," Mr. Miller shouted. "Eleanor, are you alive?" Eleanor opened her eyes. "Alive, Michael, alive. It's just my leg." The men, grunting, fashioned a makeshift stretcher from their jackets and 2 sturdy fir branches. They worked together but cautiously, constantly glancing at the huge gray beast who stood nearby, never taking his amber eyes off them. Gray wasn't growling anymore, but his entire body was tense, like a tightly drawn bowstring. He was a silent but formidable escort, and everyone felt it. Carefully trying not to cause Eleanor any more pain, they lifted her and carried her home. Gray walked alongside, level with the stretcher, not leaving her side for a step. His shadow glided over the snowy path, making him look like a guardian spirit from an old forest fairy tale. He escorted them all the way to the porch, and only when Eleanor was carried inside did he allow himself to relax a little. But he didn't leave. He lay down right on the doorstep, blocking the entrance. His watch continued. Eleanor was bedridden for most of that winter. Her leg, just as the paramedic Mr. Miller had brought from the county seat, the next day had predicted, was healing slowly and poorly. "A fracture with displacement, and at your age, Eleanor," he said, shaking his head sympathetically. "You need rest, complete rest." For Eleanor, who had spent her entire life in motion, this was a difficult ordeal. She lay in her bed by the window, looking out at the snow-covered yard, feeling as helpless as that little pup she had once found in the forest. But she was not alone. The town, which had once shunned and feared her, now showed an unexpected, almost timid concern. It began with Michael Miller's wife, Tasia. She came by a few days later, knocked shyly, and without stepping past the threshold, left a pot of hot chicken soup and a loaf of freshly baked bread on the bench. "This is for you, Eleanor. Get well soon," she mumbled, and quickly left, as if embarrassed by her own kindness, and then others followed. The men, gathering together, chopped enough firewood for her for the entire winter, stacking it neatly. Someone fixed the leaky roof on her shed. The women brought milk, cottage cheese, or a jar of pickled mushrooms. They did it silently, hardly ever entering the house, leaving their offerings on the porch like ancient pagans, bringing gifts to a forest spirit. It was their clumsy form of apology and deep respect. They weren't just helping a sick old woman. They were helping the mistress of the very wolf who had shown them all what true loyalty and justice meant. And Gray took on the primary responsibility. He became more than just a guardian. He became a provider. Almost every morning when Eleanor woke up, she would see his catch on her doorstep. Sometimes a rabbit with a broken leg, sometimes a grouse, and one time he even dragged a young wounded fawn that a hunter had likely failed to track down. Gray never touched the prey himself. He would carefully place it on the clean snow, right by the steps, and then retreat to his observation post by the fence. He was feeding her, just as she had once fed him when he was weak and helpless. Now he was feeding her. The circle of life, which she had once set in motion with her compassion, had closed. He was repaying his debt. Eleanor would weep, looking at these bloody gifts. She wept with gratitude and with a sharp, piercing understanding of how simple and honest the laws of this world, the world of nature, were, and how much humans had twisted them with their greed and malice. In the spring, when the snow melted and the air filled with the damp, intoxicating sense of new life, something happened that Eleanor had secretly been both expecting and dreading most of all: the call of the wild. She was sitting on the porch, having made it outside for the first time in months. Her legs still ached, but she could now walk slowly with the help of a cane. Gray was lying at her feet, basking in the warm spring sun. Suddenly, he lifted his head, his ears perked. Eleanor listened too, but heard nothing. But he heard something. At the edge of the forest, where a young birch grove began, a visitor appeared. A young, slender, graceful gray she-wolf. She didn't come close, keeping her distance, but it was clear she had come for Gray. He stood up. His whole body tensed. He looked at her, then at Eleanor. In his eyes was a storm of emotions. Recognition, curiosity, anxiety. "Go," Eleanor said quietly, her voice trembling. "Go on, my dear. This is your destiny." As if understanding her words, he slowly walked towards his visitor. They met in the middle of the clearing. They stood for a long time, cautiously sniffing each other, communicating in their own language of movements and glances inaccessible to humans. Then the she-wolf, giving him some kind of sign, trotted back into the forest. Gray froze for a moment. Then he turned one last time and looked at Eleanor. He looked at the old house, the porch, the woman who had become his pack. His gaze held everything: gratitude for his rescue, a love he couldn't express in any other way, and a quiet, bright sadness of farewell. Then he turned away decisively and with powerful leaps bounded after his companion. A moment later his gray figure dissolved into the green thicket. Eleanor sat on the porch, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. But they were not tears of sorrow, they were tears of relief and pride. He had gone to create his own pack, to become a leader, to continue his lineage. He had gone to become what he was born to be. She had let him go with love, asking for nothing in return. She thought she would never see him again, but she was mistaken. Sometimes on quiet summer evenings, as she sat on her porch watching the sunset, she would see a familiar gray silhouette on a distant hill against the backdrop of the fiery sky. He would just stand there, looking at her house. And one day, a year later, she spotted several more figures next to him, his mate and small, frolicking pups in the grass, his new family. He hadn't forgotten. He remembered. He was simply living his life, but a piece of his heart would forever remain here, in this old house on the edge of the forest, with the woman who had once given him the gift of life. Eleanor Vance lived to a ripe old age, peacefully and contentedly. Her leg never fully healed, but now her neighbors, who had become almost like family, helped her, and all the residents of the Gloomwood area knew that her house and her peace were protected by an unseen but faithful gray guardian. Protected by Eleanor's law, a law by which compassion is always returned with devotion, and the circle of life, once broken by cruelty, is always closed by mercy. If you enjoyed the story, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Until next time.